Sorry, I'm waiting for my cue. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this event. My name is Elena Liquete. I'm the Executive Director for MBA programs at the School of Management. We have quite a mixed audience this evening, so we've put together a program for you. You're all here to listen to Dimo on what type of entrepreneur are you. But for those of you who are interested to find out more about the Executive MBA, please stay in the room after Dimo's presentation is finished. Everybody else can go out and enjoy the drinks. We'll stay in the room just for 10-15 minutes. We'll have a short talk about the Executive MBA, and then we'll join everybody else for drinks. Is that okay? Sounds like a plan? Thank you. So I'll very quickly introduce Dimo Dimov, Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the School of Management. Dimo is an accomplished scholar, teacher, and consultant with vast international experience. And he has recently been ranked among the top 100 entrepreneurship professors in the world. Dimo has lived in the US and various countries in Europe, and something I'm particularly jealous of is that he speaks 6 languages, so he's asked me not to test him. Enjoy the session. Thank you, Dimo.
Thank you, Elena. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the University of Bath School of Management. Thank you for coming tonight, both in person and to those who are joining us online. What I'd like to do over the next hour or so is share with you a few ideas, hopefully to start a dialogue that we can continue beyond tonight. These are topics that I'd like to discuss and talk about, and hopefully we'll do this together beyond. To kick things off, I'd like to start with a little exercise. And I'd like to ask you to spot the entrepreneur in this picture. Could be the one. Okay, could be. It could be all of them. Could be all of them. Could be none of them. Correct? So what's quite interesting, I think this is a very it gets us into thinking right away into what's going on in this picture when we start thinking about who is an entrepreneur, what is an entrepreneur. So what is going on here? One thing that's clear is that this is not about who people are, and it's not about what people do. In fact, it's interesting that for over 30, 40 years, these have been the questions that have been driving research. Who is an entrepreneur and what is it entrepreneurs do? But these are not the relevant questions. What would come out of this, just looking at the picture, is that what would define someone as entrepreneur or not is the meaning of what they do, the meaning of the action that they do. Now, if we think about where does the meaning of the action come from, there's obviously whatever surrounds the person. So we can have the same person doing exactly the same movement, and yet that can have completely different meaning. So the person could be a friend in that moment. It could be a parent, if that movement is to something that relates to communicating with or to parenthood. It could be a manager, or it could be an entrepreneur. So these are roles. This is the situational cue that gives a meaning to what someone is doing. So, and meaning is actually the one thing that makes us uniquely human. This is what humanity is about. Humanity is about meaning, which is going beyond the situations we are, the things that we see. And we've laid out this layer of reasoning, concepts, language. And most of us operate at that layer and not at the layer of the things that we can touch or hear or see. So meaning is uniquely human. If we think of the field of vision, and this is the situation that we had in the opening picture, what we have there is, let's call it the real situation, and they are objects, they're movements that we see, and if we engage our hearing, we'll hear some sounds. But these may not necessarily be meaningful. In fact, imagine someone just looking from the outside into this room and sees me talking and gesticulating, and you're sitting and looking at me. This could mean so many different things. So they have to, well, of course, this is a university, so they'll be able to infer something about what's going on. But just by looking, it's very difficult to tell. So we as humans construct beyond that field of vision. We have the field of meaning. And that field of meaning, going above the picture that we're just seeing, has so many other things. And I would like to call that an imaginary situation. In the imaginary situation, it takes all the things that we see and touch and feel and hear, but overlays on them futures, aspirations, beliefs, roles. These are things that we cannot see, and yet these are the things that give meaning. Now let's think about imaginary situations in more detail. Now there are two types. One imaginary situation, and this actually is represented by the one we're in now, is a situation that's pretty much defined. It's defined by the social practices in which we participate. So here we are engaged in the practice of university life and dialogue and discussion as part of this masterclass. And as part of these social practices, there are well-defined roles. You could be sitting in a coffee shop talking to someone, and you could be participating in one of several. This could be your friend, this could be, again, your child, it could be your parent, it could be your colleague, it could be your supervisor, it could be your student, depending on, it could be so many different things. And for each of these things, you're participating in that practice. But the other kind of situation is the imaginary situation that has nothing to do with social practices, but it has to do with envisioning. Creating a vision of something, creating a new meaning. It's unique to us, to which we aspire and try to create. So I would say that when we operate in defined roles, we operate as managers, and we're engaged in envisioning, we operate as entrepreneurs. As an entrepreneur. And of course, there are all the gradations in between. Now let's think about, there are different ways of envisioning. There's no single way. And I could relate these to, these are recognized as the 4 roles that are associated with creating things. Engineers create, scientists create, artists create, and designers create. So let's just think about, just to look at the room. How many of you have a background, and by background you mean the degree, the previous you studied, that is related to engineering? You just raise your hand. So some people in the room. Science? Okay, some people with science. Art? Some artists in the room by background. And design? Some people. And some people raise their hand several times, which is quite interesting. What do you think about the rest? I don't know what the rest of, if anybody has anybody not raised their hand? Okay. What could these be? I'm not trying to. Accountant, okay. Business management, law, strategy, economist, okay. Any others? Okay, so these are, what's interesting is these are roles that are not necessarily creative, because their task is to take care of things as they are. But the creative, and I'll come back to these creative roles slightly later. So with this very simple exercise in the introduction, we can begin to find some common language. So we can talk about imagination. So this is basically envisioning things in your mind, in our minds, that do not exist. We can then start talking about creativity, which is using imagination to solve particular challenges. And we can talk about innovation, which is then applying that creativity to create specific solutions that create value. So that takes us along a very simple cycle, called a cycle of thinking. Imagination, creativity, innovation, and the cycle continues. But what is interesting is that the driving force, what manages that cycle, this is the role of the entrepreneur, this is the role of entrepreneurship, is what operates and manages the cycle. And that raises a very interesting question. And it is that the question whether you are or you're not an entrepreneur is actually not interesting, and I would say not relevant. We can set that aside as being a question that is often asked, which is, I'm just not an entrepreneur. Are you not? No, I'm not an entrepreneur, so you step away. So that question is not interesting. The interesting question that comes out of this is, are you creating an envisioned future? Some people may say no, some people may say yes, but I think most people would like the answer to be yes. Because aspiring, going after, what we envision is something that corresponds to basic human propensity to create, to improve, to create a better world. That's a very, very, very inherently human. And therefore, if we want to answer yes to that question, the next question that comes, well, what does being in the cockpit of that process look like? Not to look at it from the outside. What does it look like from the inside? Very much like the cockpit of an airplane. Think about a cockpit. It has instruments. It's designed to take us in a particular direction. The instruments are telling us where things are, and there are some levers that we can pull or buttons to push to take action to keep us moving. So in the same way, on that entrepreneurial journey, if we start thinking about that, what are the levers that are applied, that would apply to that? So I'd like to start now, start with this idea of the thinking engine. Let's call it the thinking engine of entrepreneurship. To illustrate this very simply, we will do an exercise. And those sitting on that end, you will see next to you on the floor, there's a sheet of paper and a pen. I call it a silent drawing game. Silent is the key word here, because you should not discuss things without this. This is to be done in silence. So the game would be as follows. This would flow row by row. So the person at the end would start the game on the blank sheet of paper. Each person would think of something to draw, and the first person in the row would make a move, which means you draw one thing without lifting the pen. This is just some of the suggestions of the things that you can do: a circle, a line, trying to create it. And then you pass the sheet to the person next to you. Then they add their entry. This is passed. So what I like to do is, I like the sheet to go this way and then back. And I'd like to see the pictures that we see coming out at the end. And we can, the faster we do this, the faster we'll get to the end. Okay, I see the sheets are making their way back, so we'll soon be able to. We'll stop once they make it to the end. We'll stop. We could be doing this for quite a while. You were the quickest, yeah. Okay, so if they've made it to the end, all we need to do is perhaps the person at the end could just hold it to the rest of the room. We're not gonna go around. We can have a display afterwards. So there's one kind of picture. There's all kinds of. I'm not gonna show all of them, but yeah, you can see that there are pictures emerging. So let me get some quick reactions to what happened as part of that game. What was your confused? Okay. So maybe I kind of preempted things too much by giving too much structure. It could have been left completely open. But how many of you?
I think you need to imagine what you can make out of what other people have drawn. Like you can kind of make it into a sensible image.
Okay, so you can, and you do this continuously. Well, if you do this several times, every time the sheet passes through your hands, you would be engaging in that. So, and how many of you, for the end product is exactly what you had in mind at the beginning? Okay, so it's very interesting. If we try and think about what happened, we have a very, very simple. This is a very simple way of representing what just happened. It's a very simple model where you have an idea, you draw, and then there's an emerging picture that comes back to you, and then you have to go through the idea, the drawing, and the emerging picture back to you. So this is a very simple process. It's also dynamic because it happens step by step and over time. It's also recursive, which means the output at one step becomes the input to the next. So it's a very simple thing. In fact, this is the simplest model that you can have of a dynamical system. And what's fascinating about this is that you can produce outcomes that are completely open-ended. You actually cannot contain, you cannot imagine all the possible ways in which the drawing can come back at the end. Because this is done by the input that each of you makes. What's also very interesting, since we talked about cockpit earlier, is that there are parts of this game or exercise that you can control. You can completely control the ideas that come into your mind, and you can control the entry that you make. This is what you can control. What you can't control is the emerging picture. When it comes back to you, it's something that was not quite in line, maybe perhaps, with what you had in mind. And the reason that happens is that there are others involved. So this is also not only a simple and dynamic and recursive game, but it's also a social game. And guess what? What other game is social? Well, entrepreneurship is a social game. We seek to create value for others, even if it is to fulfill purpose that we have. Others have to participate. And this same model we can use to represent the entrepreneurial process as well. So we can very simply, just by changing the labels, we have exactly the same model. We perceive things, we envision, we imagine, we take a step towards that. By the time it's our, if you wish, turn to act again, things have changed. Because we're not alone in the world. There are others, and just like we envision, they envision as well. We want our future, they want theirs. And when you put so many people together, if any of you have ever bounced on a bouncy castle, you will know exactly how that feels, where different people are bouncing at different times. Very difficult to be in control. Yeah, there is part of this. This is the agent. This is the person in the cockpit. What you can control is what you see, perception, and the things that you do. But the actual outcomes are beyond our control. Another way to think about that is that in seeing and doing, which is the first part of the process, we're actually engaged, we're in a context of discourse. We have to communicate with others who often question our reasons or try to clarify and understand what we think. I say, I have an idea, and the next thing you say is, what is the idea? I explain it and say, well, I don't understand this. Can you clarify this? So this discourse happens all the time. If I say I would like to do X, you would say, well, why would you want to do that? What would you like to achieve? Is this the best thing to do? Perhaps you can do something else. And I try to reason with you. So that's the discourse that happens. On the other end, consequences, they're generated by all these other people out there who are also agents, who also see the world in their own way, who also act, try to make it in their own image. And yet, when you put all these things together, we have with a simple system that becomes dynamic and you would say unpredictable. On this concept of discourse, there's two things that discourse is about. It's about what we see, and it's about what we do. These are the two things within our control. And these quickly, depending on the context, turn into questions of relevance. Is what we see relevant? And what we do, is what we do justified? How many of you have been in meetings where you discuss something and people throw ideas and someone has a wild idea and you say, well, that's not relevant. And you move on. or someone perceives we could do X, you say, well, that's not appropriate. That's not justified. So these two processes work in a way to constrain. So if I take a little sidestep here and think about management for a second. What is good management? Good management is something that rests on 3 pillars, to put it very simply. Management is about having clear purpose, consistency, and rationality. Purpose is about goals. They need to be clear. They need to be agreed upon. Relevance is about compliance. We put structures in place. We agree. There's beliefs. There are norms. And relevance is about fitting, complying with that. And rationality or justification is about decision procedures and being held accountable for the decisions we make. And accountability is about giving reasons, and these reasons need to be accepted by others as valid. So these are very strong pillars. That's what good management is. But since we started talking about entrepreneurship, this has a dark side of the good management. The dark side is that when the purpose is given, preset and pre-agreed, it becomes this huge gravitational body that pulls everything else towards it. So it has this impact on ideas. The ideas need to be consistent with that purpose, and that's where consistency comes in. Rationality defines what actions we can take. So that gravitational force, when you put these 3 things together, creates this line. I like to call this the status quo runway. And management is very good at keeping things on the status quo. Not today. What happens as part of that, as part of being a good manager, is being able to, with all these ideas and possible things that could be done and possible goals that could be pursued, is to say no. These are not things that to be done. We need to be focused. We need to know to exactly get to where we go, where we would like to go. And that is on the one hand, it's a great skill and practice to exercise. On the other hand, as we see today, when you operate in a fast-changing, dynamic environment, we often say we like to be innovative, we like to do new things, we like to re-envision, we like to reimagine, we like to revamp what we do, and yet the pillars that we have to our managerial practice they're actually preventing us from stepping outside of that. So if we think about a dynamic world and what it means to manage in it, you've probably seen this picture before. We talk about a plan. We all know that the plan, things are not going to go according to plan. But the idea being focused and focused on execution is that no matter what happens, no matter what obstacles on the way, we're trying to make our way through to reach the flag, to reach the end goal. And in this model, I would say this is a situation where action serves the model. The model is given, and action is supposed to serve that. Now, what is the opposite? Something that is, when something is very dynamic, we can also imagine things operating that way, where at every step of the way, rather than pushing through the obstacles, you can try and reimagine the reality. We can try what we're about, reimagine the reality. And this is a situation where the model serves the action. And this is the difference between model of. We model something, it's a model of, this becomes fixed, and our goal is to cater to it, versus model for. The only purpose of the model is to facilitate us to do something new. And as soon as we do it, that model can change to facilitate the next action. So one is more dynamic, the other one is more stable. So when the pillars of good management emerged, you could say about 100 years ago, they emerged for a very different world, where the priorities were different. The world was less dynamic, you might wish, mainly because it was grounded more in the real situation. But over the last 100 years, we've created this huge layer of meaning on top of everything, which means that things constantly change. We're talking these days about the 4th Industrial Revolution, which is a merging of physical, digital, biological phenomena. And the more things get connected, the faster they can change they can start changing even faster. So it is about thinking differently when it comes to a dynamic world. And the contrast here is between good management, where the feedback loop is we look at what happens, we take corrective action. And what often happens is we take perception's taken out of the picture. Because the purpose is given, we don't need to rethink that. We just take the corrective action. As opposed to entrepreneurial management, where we revisit what we see continuously. And in one case, this is known as a single loop learning, and this is very, very much the kind of the dominant, very, very widespread way of problem solving. It's about taking corrective action, but not really questioning assumptions or goals or values. And double loop, which is about reevaluating goals and values at certain junctions of the way. So with this in mind, we have a sense of the engine, which is this process here, and the two levers of the engine, which is what we see and what we do. These are the things that are within our control. If we put them together, we can think of perhaps looking at ourselves in the mirror to understand how is it we currently use these two levers that are within our control. And this is what the assessment I'm going to talk about. And many of you have done it. If you haven't, the link has been provided. You have the opportunity. So you've seen your personal reports, and I'd like to talk about this more to give you more context and meaning. So the two levers that I mentioned, what we see and what we do, the two levers, and what can you do with two levers? We can do many things. Push them both in one direction, push them back, one forward, one backward. So two levers, actually, you have a lot of flexibility of what you can do. So if we think of the first lever is about what we do, it is, to call it, your attitude towards the uncertainty that you face. The things that you can never know, we can never know. So there's always uncertainty in we operate. And the lever, this thinking lever, is do we rely on reason in one end? Do we try to reason and find logic and rationality and justification? Or do we engage in play? And play is about doing things for no particular reason. How many of you have asked your children, why did you do that? Just because. Just because. The kids are very, very good at play. And play is the one skill that tends to be squeezed out of us as we go through life. But it is very, very interesting to stay connected with that. Not to discount reason, as we see with most things in the management space, it's not about one thing. It's about a balance. The second lever is about what we see. And when we look at something, we can look and think of it as what it is. That's already an existing structure that kind of tells us how to complete the picture. But we can think of anything as what it is not yet. So that's openness. It could be the beginning of something new. So that's the other lever is about structure and openness. So when we put these two together, we have a very simple framework: reason versus play on the one hand, structure versus openness on the other, and it gives us a sense of 4 qualitatively different styles. Now, what usually happens with frameworks like this, and that's very, very much in the fields of strategy or management, is we look at the framework like this and we say, oh, we always like everybody aspires to be in one of the quadrants. But one of the messages today, to preempt it, is that this is about the importance of all 4, rather than singling out one particular one. So the question then, we said it's not about whether we are an entrepreneur. No, what type of entrepreneur are you, as defined by the way you use the 2 levers of thinking and acting. And I will talk about the types, but I wanted to share with you. You've taken, those of you have taken the assessment so far, and I'll explain what these mean. You can see lots of dots on the screen, which tells us what? There's lots of different ways of thinking in the room. And we saw that when we started talking about backgrounds. You all have different backgrounds, you have different ways of thinking. And so we can represent this as dots. We can also represent it as a thinking cloud. This is the collective thinking cloud of this room, and it kind of spans all the different quadrants, but kind of the peak seems to be in this quadrant. It's just playful, and I'll explain in a moment what this means. So we've looked at the mirror, The mirror tells us something. You've seen your reports, and the question is, well, what does this mean? Why do we look at the mirror? Why do we ever look at the mirror? But beyond that, well, we could just like to look at ourselves. That's one possibility. Yeah, so the mirror is a way of seeing us, kind of putting that on, think of it as on a dashboard. And what it allows us to do is to take corrective action. Oh, if I could have looked in the mirror and I realized my color is like this, and immediately I do this, right? Or my hair is down and I correct it. So the reason we use a mirror is to take some kind of, not necessarily corrective action, but it's a check on how things are. So let's try and understand what this mirror, the entrepreneurial style mirror, is telling us. So this is where the mirror goes together with a map. This is the map of all the possible styles. So the value of the mirror is that you can place yourself on the map and understand where you are, the reflection of habits, structures, routines, the way we operate, the practices in which we participate. But more importantly, by locating ourselves on the map, we can understand all the different places that we can go to. So the matrix or the map, by putting all the different, the levers, the combinations, there are 4 styles. Focused, playful, breakaway, and incremental. So they represent the combinations of reason or play and structure and openness in defining or representing the way you tend to think. I say tend, think of it as a default style. And focused is about reason and structure. You're very good at setting priorities, organizing information, setting goals, and keeping things in check. Playful is when you operate within a structure, but you like to push boundaries, you like to provoke, just to see what, again, just to see what happens. And sometimes interesting things can happen, and you can build on that. On the incremental side, you operate with reason, which means that you always reason through things, but you keep things open, as in suggestions for improvement, a new way of seeing things that might put us in a better position. And breakaway is more of a blue style. Not only you push boundaries, but you also feel not restrained by any particular structures, like to imagine new things. And my experience with this exercise is that intuitively, people would say, well, that makes sense. And in many ways, it could reflect my role. In many ways, it reflects what I'm currently comfortable with. So understanding your style is about 2 things. One is just, it's a mirror of current practices in which you participate, habits and practices. But more importantly, is about what it could be, which is this idea that now you're aware of a wider map of things that you could explore using your things. So I'd like to focus the last part of the talk on what we call kinetic thinking. This is the idea of thinking that can operate through all the different styles. I like this this phrase from Dr. Seuss. Works perfectly with thinking low, thinking high, thinking left, and thinking right, tipping up or down. All the things that you can think if you just only try. And if we think about the matrix or the map that I showed earlier, this is about development of thinking along these 2 dimensions. No matter where you are, there's always room for you to either think, if we look at the map, think west or think east or think west, think north or think south. You can think of it left, right, up and down. It doesn't matter how you define it. But there's always, no matter where you are, there's always 2 ways in which you can develop your thinking. If you're focused, you can become more playful, you become more open in the things that you see. If you're playful, you can apply more reason, you can be more open. If you break away, this is over the time you have these blue sky ideas, a little bit of focus would help you. A little bit of structure and a little bit of reason would always help. What's the first thing that entrepreneurs hear when they, with their ideas they pursue and meet an investor for the first time? Focus is the word that they hear. And equally, if you're on the incremental side, a little bit of structure and playfulness would help. So developing your style or way of thinking is about moving away from your default way of thinking. So this is something that remains hidden. If we never explore it, if we never question it, it's not something that is part of the picture in whatever we deal with. So what we'd like to do is put the thinking on the dashboard, put it in the cockpit. Imagine it's part of the cockpit. There's this instrument there that says, right now you're using this thinking. They say, well, that's interesting in that situation. Maybe I'll adjust the lever and I'll start using a different way of thinking. So it's about being able to operate through different mindsets depending on the situation in which you're in. Sometimes it helps to be playful. Sometimes it helps to be structured. Sometimes it helps to reason things through. Other times to be more open. In fact, play is a concept. Imagination in play is something that develops in children around the age 4. And this is children's way to escape the constraints of the situations that they're in. Put them in a room, there's only one box in the room, and you would think that they would be bored. But very soon, they can imagine that room to be so many different things. They begin living in a different world. So you escape the situational constraints. That's the power of imagination in play. Very powerful for children. There's no reason why it wouldn't be powerful for organizations as well. So in practice, it is important because we often talk about, we have an idea, we got to go start up, scale up. Think of it as a 0 to 100 journey. The reality is that this is not a straight line. And the journey would look like something like this. 0 to 1, think of it as downwards. This is about finding what works. Once we have something that works, it's about scaling 1 to 100. And why it's interesting to distinguish between these two phases is that they require different ways of thinking, different ways of operating. The beginning phase is about creativity, imagination, trying different things, experimentation to add. So this is about open-ended exploration. But once we have something that works, and once we think about how do we make this bigger, it is about processing, logic, discipline, execution. So it would become, switch a different gear when it comes to the way we think. So it is about focused execution. And examples about, just to use just one classic one, is this is the example of Netflix, is they started out as a challenger to Blockbuster, and they was their online, the model is a challenge to Blockbuster. After a while, this is something they did very well in, and this whole space began to decline. But before this model starts peaking, they're on to the next wave, which is, think of it as a next wave of disruption. So by the time the first model peaks and it starts going down, they have one that is going up. So this is this ability to jump from one model to the next. This is what reinvention is. And if we go back to this idea of how thinking works across the different stages, we can see that early on, at this open-ended exploration, we make full use of the 4 ways of thinking. And I've laid out the moves, and they look like instructions for making a Rubik's Cube. So we structure, we play, we open, and then we reason. We structure, play, open, reason. So we go through this cycle until we have something that works. And once it works, it's all about execution. It's all about being focused, incremental, focused, incremental, focused, incremental. Now, when we lay several of these across time, so across time we think, well, okay, we'll develop that. But once this is going and growing well, we need to be thinking about the next one. So we start to be exploring that. So by the time the first one is over, we jump to the next one, and so on and so forth. So when you stack them like this over time, these different, call it models, business models, call it businesses, call it ventures. You can use different phrases here. And when you look vertically, all of a sudden you realize that at any point in time, you need all 4 ways of thinking that need to be interlinked. Some is about exploring new ideas. Others are executing and growing existing one. And depending on which one you're called on to contribute, you can operate in that mindset. So why do we need to be kinetic in practice? Is we started out with envisioning the future and started about laying things. But there's one thing that we as humans, when we think about the future, and this comes from psychology, is that whenever we think about future events, we cannot imagine all the details. So that's one. So they're usually very fuzzy. And yet, spatially, when we see something that is distant, spatially we understand that that distant thing is going to be fuzzy. So we have a good sense of space. We don't have as good a sense of time. That we have a distant event, we don't realize that it's going to be fuzzy in the same way that it's spatially. So we not only cannot imagine all the details, but usually what we imagine is sourced from memory, the things that we experience. And that requires a conscious effort to go beyond kind of the pictures that memory provide and try to create new pictures. And we usually tend to ignore what we cannot imagine. And that usually works both ways. We ignore things that could actually contribute to something working out, and equally we can ignore things that might derail the project. So the idea here is that because imagination has all these gaps when we look ahead, we have to be a bit more deliberate in about the thinking that we use. So what does that mean? You would say, well, we need something tangible to work with here. This is all very, very abstract. What do we do when it comes to seeing and doing, or seeing in particular? What do we do when we look at this picture? What happens? Something very quickly happens in our mind. We see this visual input. We immediately have the label horse that goes with it. That gets locked, and we immediately say horse. But two things happen if you do this. This happens very fast. In fact, our evolutionary advantage for survival is to see something, to be able to categorize it very quickly. Is this going to eat me, or is this something that I can make use of? And accordingly, you either flee or approach. So that's very good. But if you play it in small motion, what happens is we have an object, we attach a concept to it, and this is what creates meaning. And as I said earlier, when children learn to play, this is around the age 4, is when they learn to separate object and concept. So this is a very, very important human skill, and kids enjoy it tremendously. So when we say kinetic in seeing and doing, one is unlocking what we see. And that means we look at an object. Okay, well, that's the stimulus. But what is it that we see? So we start to linger in this concept space. We have our default concept that we'd like to apply it. But if we look longer, if we think longer, if we imagine longer, we'll be able to come up with a range of different concepts. So back to the original object. So exploring, we can say horse, but we can also say a pet or a friend. We can also say a factor of production. We can also say a race competitor. And the interesting thing about these concepts, just applying different concepts, they allow us to do new things. If you think about the race, now you can race. If you think about factor of production, you can think about work and other things. And so the classic example, to use the example of Apple, is that you can think of this as a computer, but a different concept was applied to it. It was seen originally as a household appliance. What if we see the computer as an appliance? All of a sudden we have to think about design, we have to think about the way it looks in the house. It's not going to be hidden in the back room, it's going to have a prominent place. And that allows us to do new things and to envision new things, just because we work with a different concept. Unlocking what we do is then a question of fixing a concept and applying it to different objects. Again, kids are very good at this. We have the concept of a horse. We look around for objects. We see a stick. We can ride the stick. We see a chair. We can ride the chair as well. And so that's having a concept, but applying it to different objects. Again, to think about computing, we can start thinking about all these other objects as computers. All of a sudden, we see them differently. So this is no longer a watch. In fact, today, phones, well, they're called phones, but they're in fact very few people make phone calls on them. We use for all others. So at some point, that is going. It's a residual concept. And here, there's some talk about a car. In fact, this is what some of the Tesla cars are. They're in fact computers. They're reimagined cars built around the computing infrastructure. So putting the two things together, we have the object and the concept. We can operate in the object space. We can operate in the concept space. And all of a sudden, imagine all the possibilities. Think of a quick exercise. Let's pick up something. MBA. What's the concept that comes to mind? MBA, this is the, what I mean is the going through the process. So studying, okay, so that's one concept. And when we say studying, with studying comes all the things that we can do. We think about reading, we think about researching, we think about writing. Any other concepts? Career change, okay. And when you use that, you start imagining new things that you can do. What comes with career change? More money. You can start looking around. You can start talking to people that you would not normally talk to because you're looking for some useful information or trying to find out about new careers. So if it was about studying, you do one thing. If you think career change, all of a sudden you're thinking a different thing. Any other concept? Happiness. Okay. So if we think about happiness, think about what are the things that we can do as part of an MBA experience. Travel. Friends. Okay. So all of a sudden, and then if we pick up friends, we can go back to the concept space, imagine. So this is about going back and forth, and the space we can explore becomes infinite. In fact, putting these two together, and in one case we have meaning that is fixed. That's what the focused thinking is good for. Object, concept, they're fixed. We know exactly what it is. We work around optimizing it. But we can be playful in the object space. We can be playful in the concept space. We can operate there, and we can operate in both. And so this is linking this back to the original styles. Is that focus is being given a meaning and trying to optimize structure, restructure within it. Playful is about picking up a concept and thinking about different objects. They could be linked with that concept. Incremental becomes playing in the concept space, reconceptualizing, seeing things in a new light that again enable you to do new things. And breakaway becomes a combination of both. And going back full circle to where we started with different ways of imagining, now we can see the creative roles is in a way is a reflection of all these different ways of operating the thinking levers. Engineers is about finding new combinations within the existing space. It's about optimizing, making something work. Well, optimization is very much an engineering work. Scientists look for new concepts and theories. They look for seeing the world in a new light. And so when a new theory takes over, all of a sudden we think differently. We can do different things. Designers is about finding new solutions. So we have a concept we'd like to work with, and it's what's the best way to capture that. What's the object? What's the thing that would represent that best? And then artists, they can actually operate on both fronts. So this is about, in a way, completely new meaning, which is new objects, new concept. So I'd like to end here to just to visualize for you what this kinetic journey would look like. So we start in a space, and then we push the boundaries of concepts and objects. So all of a sudden we're in an enlarged space, and this is a space of new meaning. After a while, this new meaning becomes the status quo. This becomes the meaning that we take for granted. Now that then becomes the platform for new exploration and even newer meaning. But after a while, that's taken for granted, and we can go. And this very much resembles the way life evolves. You know, from a single organism many years ago to where we are today. And what's the main mechanism behind evolution? Mutation. But if we have to say what is a mutation, say it in different words, a mistake. A mutation is a mistake. He was supposed to copy the gene, and he made a mistake. And that mistake led to, well, the proliferation that we've seen. And what is often the one thing that managers look for? Eliminating mistakes. Good management is a way of eliminating mistakes. Well, with that comes kind of the dark side that I spoke about earlier. And when you let that operate, we can see kind of the journey. And this is all about moving the levers in different ways. So as a way of summarizing what we've done is kind of the big pictures. We started out with this idea of the engine. What role does thinking play in entrepreneurship? Well, thinking is what we're responsible for. Thinking is what makes us human. Meaning is what is associated with thinking. And the two levers that we can operate, what we see and what we do. Very much aspects of thinking. Then we talked about the map. These are all the different ways of thinking that are possible, organized into the 4 styles. That's the map. You've seen the assessment, the mirror, where you look at yourself, you can place yourself in the map. But this is not about who you are. It's about who you could be, depending on where you are and all the different ways and places you can explore. So it is in a way about the toolkit, this idea of the object concept, flexibility, and what it allows us to explore. And that's about personal development. So on that note, these are the ideas I wanted to share with you. And I'll be very happy to answer any questions you may have. So thank you very much for your attention. And we can take questions online as well. So.
Can't hear me, my goodness. Things that you hear is people moving into the entrepreneurial space through frustration. I couldn't find this, so I went out and did it for myself. What your...
Well, this is an example of a playful, if you wish, engage. Usually, and that's very much the beginning of a lot of journeys, is that there is a frustration, something's not working, and we just follow our curiosity, which is a very, very natural thing to do, to say, well, how can I make this work? Not because I want to build a business around it, but I'm curious, I want to make it work for myself. And so this is again, it's not a you want to see what happens, but you're driven by the curiosity, and then depending on what happens, often it's a positive result. You share this with others, where they say, well, that's great. Can I have that as well? In fact, one of the richest spaces, there's an American Association of Juvenile Products. And if you look at their websites, you will see all the products that parents have come up with that relate to children. I mean, there's a huge array of products. They all start with this very much personal space. It could be a frustration. I want to have something that works for me. And the next thing you see is other people see that. I'd like to have that as well. And it takes on. If you had to make the judgment at the beginning, is that worthwhile pursuing? The answer would be no. But putting that playful cap on and say, well, I just want to see what will happen.
Your talk focused a lot on individuals and their entrepreneurial types, whatever. Have you anything to say about what happens when you start bringing groups of people together? You know, does one type dominate, for example, or does it become an average, or can you say something about that, please?
Well, there's a lot about groups. It's an excellent question. A lot about group dynamics that goes beyond just the way we think. With groups, we go into personalities, interactions, and a lot of the group dynamics that we're familiar with every time we talk about groups. But this particular one would focus attention to, again, you can look at the group mirror and see what are the different ways in which members of the group think. So if it happens that all the members are like-minded, it could be that this becomes a gap that could be explored either collectively or through trying to put the team together that becomes more balanced. So just one more thing to think about when it comes to group. In this case, it's about what is the way that people think. Because one of the things we see when people think alike is they can reach consensus very quickly. But very early on in the exploration of the idea, consensus is not necessarily something that we want. We want the one person who would say, well, okay, I understand this, but what about this? What about if we did that? And so they wouldn't be shut down by others. Say, well, that's not relevant. But they'll be given the leeway to see what happens.
Thank you. So my question is, from my personal view, I feel like that the value in a corporation is quite different from the value as you an entrepreneur. Let's say, for example, the budget. Maybe in a corporation, we will do everything under the budget. But as an entrepreneur, you will concern more about this project. You forget about the budget now. You don't have any budget for project beforehand. And let's say there's another very popular value. It's like you cannot work alone. If you work alone, you will work fast. If you work together, you work further. If there is one value you want us to drop, as you want to move from corporation to entrepreneur, so what is that? Am I clear?
Well,
yes. So my basic thinking is that there's a lot of different. I can see that a successful entrepreneur could not be fit in a corporation. So what exactly should we shift our way of thinking?
I mean, again, a very fascinating question. One of the things that we see, particularly with corporations that are very much budget and structure focused, is that when you look at people within that, they're very heavily in the focused quadrant. So we see that very clearly. Focus resonates, this is about reason and structure. One of the most fascinating areas I find is exactly around the area of budgeting. So my role before academia, I was a CFO. And so budget is something that you set, but you also sometimes reset. So budgets are fascinating because we have this budget, actual, and then discrepancy. In the discrepancy, if it's negative, it's red, and if it's positive, it's a different colors. And one of the things we do when we go down the report is just focus on the red. But there are different ways to interpret the discrepancy. If something negative is happening, is one, it could be we're not delivering or executing the way we should. So we should really work harder, take different action, and really bring it in line with budget. Or it could be the things are changing, some new things are happening, and that's reflected. That's the first signal that we get. So starting from the question was, what should give? Well, given that kind of organization is focused, two things. It should become more playful. And that's a very difficult, it's easy for me to say, but very difficult to implement as a culture, values within structures. Because the fine line between somebody being playful and somebody being inefficient is a very fine one. It's very easy to label something inefficient. And then, so that's one. And the second one is open. Openness is about interpreting the signals, what is happening, interpreting in a way that's not necessarily part of the dominant narrative. But usually, the people who have the wild interpretation as the ones that are either forced to leave the room or they leave in frustration and kind of they're self-selected out. And these are the voices that we never heard. So I think the short answer is playful and open. In whatever way this can be implemented within an organization.
So one of the worry point is that even when you're working as an individual or working as a group, even if you are kind of following the principles of kinetic thinking, you are exploring various concepts, you are exploring various objects, but as a whole, as a group, you could be limited to a set of options or set of concepts. But how do you really get out of that closed set of concepts and objects and think beyond that? Sometimes it's very difficult because you already kind of assume that you're doing what's required, but there could be many more possibilities.
Well, in this case, it's all about reflecting on the things that you take for granted, the assumptions that you have in the background. So this is this idea of making your default mindset visible so you can engage with it. Children have no problem escaping those constraints because they can reimagine the situation. They can almost operate in this parallel world, which is the imaginary. So that's their way of escaping situational constraint. there's no reason why that cannot be a solution when it comes to just imagining something different that is possible. Not always. There are always constraints and pressures and other things. So this is not about a magic wand that all of a sudden changes things.
Listening to some of the questions and your presentation, very much in the forefront of my mind is a company called HomeServe, who set up a small group called HomeServe Labs to try and produce exactly this free thinking and the playful and open approach. And it's been very interesting. I've been lucky enough to watch them going through this process for the last 3 years. And it's been very interesting seeing them trying to do that and trying to prevent the much larger corporate influence coming in and starting to constrain what they do and how they work. So as a case study, it might well be one worth looking at. It's in progress at the moment.
Oh, excellent. There's lots of best practice, lots of good practices around it. It's in a way, it's making them more visible, so we have a large set of things to learn from. There's a question here at the front that I'm nervously anticipating.
Thank you. My name's Tim Chater. I work in corporate venture management and open innovation, and I can see the application of that in terms of resource allocation and cultural set, I suspect you might say. What I can't see, and I'd like your opinion on, is the applicability of this model in real entrepreneurship, but at the grassroots level, the single person startup, the 2 or 3 people startup, and what evidence have you of this kinetic thinking working in practice, and the outputs that result of this kinetic thinking?
Okay, well, I mean, the applicability is there. This model resonates with entrepreneurs as much as it resonates with organizations.
Could you give me some examples of the outputs that have been tracked as a result of that, then?
Well, if again, as I said earlier, you often have people who start with wild ideas and start pursuing those, and through the lenses of this, you would say, well, this is where you need to structure, focus, and exactly determine what is the space in which you would like to operate. So focus is important if you're a breakaway entrepreneur. Does that make sense? No? Okay.
No, just it's some of the evidence base that says, okay, well, in what situation would you get that breakaway entrepreneur, and what evidence is it? What does it produce? So you've got different mindsets that you're describing there, and different types of entrepreneur that work. Well, what are the outputs that you're looking to achieve from those different types? Is it a team thing? Is it an individual thing? What are you expecting as a result of this work? On an entrepreneurial basis.
Well, no, the expectation is, let me see if I can phrase it this way. It's a level of comfort with the control that people have. Okay, there's a reason for it. We started with the recursive model. We started with the drawing game. So this is not the place to look for evidence in terms of outputs when the outputs, the things that happen, are beyond our control. They can never be 100% with. So in that sense, this is not the type of evidence that we can and should be after.
So you still haven't answered my question, Dimo, which is, so with the applicability of that to an entrepreneur then, what is that? What is the applicability? How can this work? How can kinetic thinking work for me as an individual entrepreneur?
Well, in your particular, we can sit down, we can talk about what your aspirations, your ideas are, and we can have a set of things that you can do. We can do a set of concepts that you can play with. Okay? Yeah, it's about taking you to the next step. It's not about charting a plan for you. You can only take things one step at a time.
Is that similar to actually, as an entrepreneur or as a startup, having or being willing to pivot if things are not going right in the way they originally anticipated? Is that the concept of pivoting?
So that's the concept of pivoting, and here this takes it to a slightly different level. The pivoting you can do at 2 levels as well. You can pivot in a concept space, what the business, and you can pivot in the object space. So think about the simple example. If I try to sell this to you, and you say no, one thing happened, I get a negative outcomes. There's three things, there's three ways in which I can reflect on this. The first one is I did a bad job selling, so I can try a different pitch. The second one is that you may have been the situation why you may have been the wrong person to sell to. So then I have to think about going to another person. And the third one is this may have been the wrong product to begin with. So this ability to reflect and to understand that if I think that this is the product to have, lots of assumptions go into that. If I question why it is that I think that way, it would allow me from that single action to say, well, there's two things that are going on. I can become more disciplined and deliberate. So let me try and eliminate this one by one. If it's a pitch issue, I'll change my pitch and see what happens. If it's not, I'll move back, reconceptualize the customer, try with a different. If that's not, maybe I'll go back to the level of product. And this ability to operate through these level of abstraction, this is what thinking is about. That's why thinking is important. Probably still hasn't answered this way, but we'll continue this. Continue to the reception. Yes.
A glass of wine or a coffee.
Yeah. Sure. The mic.
Who's first?
Yeah. Okay, we'll take both quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name's Pete Adams. I've just quit my job and started off as a single, self-employed entrepreneur, I guess. So just interesting here and there how the applicability of this might apply to my business, which I've got no customers, no income as yet, and needed to get started. So if anyone wants any health and safety advice, there's my business. And it really resonated with me about how the different, how the model that you had there at the start off of my concept of selling advice as a consultant has then already, with my thinking in the last few weeks of how I might work, gone to a license model or selling different types of products than just the advice I was giving, and all sorts of different ways there. And I think I've kind of naturally done some of that thinking in the different areas, but putting that model and that concept in what I'll take away tonight is that there is a systematic way I could get my thinking to be different to make it all happen. So I suppose in answer to your question, it's very useful to me as a entrepreneur starting out on how this model might be applicable.
Very, very interesting point. Thank you. And I think one way to add perhaps to that is that this idea when you start out in a completely open space, sometimes it's helpful to focus a little bit to secure a small base. That's why we often use to try and find those first customers or whatever it might be, and then from that base, kind of like following the loop that I was showing earlier, you can start thinking, well, where next? But unless we have some small base to stand on, it's very difficult to build. So if everything is in play, is very difficult to.
Hi, my name's Paul. What happens after you've mastered kinetic thinking?
It can. Well, I other than becoming a kinetic, I suppose the value of that is not in the sense of mastery as in you're finished. The value of that is always in applying it to life. This could be. You can be entrepreneurial not just in a startup, in an organization. You can be entrepreneurial in the public sector, in a social space. So it's about using kinetic thinking as opposed to this sense of completion and that's it. Now I'm going to go off to. It's about being always in process rather than drawing a line. So I'm not sure what happens because I guess I'll never reach that point. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dimo, do you have an article on this? I just put it on LinkedIn, and it would be good to
but an article of this is in development. Do you need the slides for the? Can you log me out afterwards?
Yeah, of course.
I'm the one. I'm the
Just to let you know, I had a thank you, Dimo, as always. Just to let you know, one of the questions I had at the beginning was, what happens if they're doing the exam and they can't come in a particular unit? How would they make it up? Because